So a couple of the things you said there really, really interest me. Actually, that idea of the invisibilization of the corporate role in empire is so unbelievably accurate or not accurate. Well, accurate, obviously, but it's so relevant to right now as well. Mm-hmm. Do you know what I mean? Because that's. People like the sort of globalized world has also become like a shadow empire for corporations. So it's really, I hadn't ever heard anyone put it like that. I love that. So the first question I really had was how much was the government involved in this side of empire? So like you had the Royal Africa Company, the East India Company, things like that. So to what extent was the government involved, or to what extent were they sort of just like, go for it, and if there's a problem, come to us, or like, was it sort of just like go and see what happens, or were they sort of actively like planning things? Or
well, there's a really interesting history in this, this kind of like interplay between the state and the private capital was really skillfully and I think massively kind of put together through the British Imperial Project. There was always an interrelation through them. I mean, just to the basis that to become a colonial company, to get a monopoly, to have trading rights over part of the world, you needed a royal charter. And so the royal charter is what creates the East India Company in 1600. And in order to get the royal charter, you obviously need to appeal to the interests of the sovereign. And so there is a kind of licensing of these companies by the state. But then after, take the East India Company as an example, after it was created in 1600, it mushrooms to the extent that by the 18th century, I mean, it's an entity that we almost haven't seen since. It's the de facto sovereign of one of the most populous regions of the world. It has a private army that's larger than the British Army at that time. Yeah, right. It collects taxes. It runs its own courts. It functions, as not just a government, but almost a kind of supranational organization, maybe like, the EU today or something like that. But it's still, in terms of its actual shareholder structure, a private company. And so these are the kind of de facto sovereigns that the British Empire really mastered in. The Hudson Bay Company in North America as well, having that similar role of a kind of state institution that's also a private company. And you can see this in the charters of them. They're given the right to collect taxes. They're given the right to arrest and imprison people. These are powers that we often think of as a sovereign power, but it allowed the British state, and particularly the kind of historicization of Britain, to kind of outsource the history of empire, to make it one step removed, to be like, this isn't the history of Britain. This is the work of the East India Company, or this is the work of the Royal Niger Company. It's not the British story. And so I think that it allowed for that kind of plausible deniability by the state. But in terms of when we look at the individuals, there was always a revolving door from these companies into Parliament. There was always the chairman of the Royal African Company was the brother of the king. And, so there's always this kind of close relationship. But in the way that it actually functioned, I think that it allowed for that kind of encasing of the British state and British history from the Imperial Project. And that's what's made it so easy for there to be such an amnesia about the British project in the contemporary moment. When we think about following decolonization, considering that the British Empire is a kind of 400-year history that really forms so many of the institutions and culture and the demography of this country, we know next to nothing about it.
Yeah.
I always play this little game with my students when I start teaching about this project, where I just put two countries up and I'm like, one of these was in the British Empire, one of them wasn't. Tell me which one. And nobody ever gets it right.
Can we do some of those now?
Absolutely.
So give me some examples. I want to know how wrong I am.
So I've got to remember which ones. I'll have to two pictures on there. One would be like Botswana and Gabon. Which one was in the British Empire, which one wasn't?
I am going to say Botswana.
Correct. You got that right, so you're on point with that one, absolutely. I would go with others like, which other ones would I have? I just remember what's on the list. Malaysia or the Philippines?
I'm going to say the Philippines?
Oh,
No?
lucky no.
Oh.
The Philippines was the Spanish and later, proxy American Empire, but no, Malaysia was part of the British Empire. And so, like, and this is something, I'll do to conference of academics, learned people, very educated. But when we think about where did the British Empire extend to, what was part of the informal empire and wasn't part of the empire, places like Iran and Argentina that had British influence but weren't part of the empire, formally, what stages did places leave the empire? Did they join the empire? We have no understanding of that. And for me, I think a big part of that is because of the way in which so much of it was outsourced to private capital interest that allowed it to be seen as separate in a way that, like, we don't have figures like Cortez or Pizarro in Spain, these kind of famous national hero colonialists, or Napoleon in France. It's seen as one step removed.
Yeah. I mean, most of the thing that I'd say maybe Britain has is the closest thing to it would be like people who were explorers or deemed explorer, like
Livingstone, even like a Cecil Rhodes to a certain extent, might be along those lines.
But that's the closest thing we probably have to. That's interesting.
And the big reason, as well as thinking about new ways to understand our history, the big reason that kind of drove me to write the book was the way in which I feel that the kind of contemporary discussion around empire has really focused on this kind of cultural and identity aspect of it, which I think actually plays into the ability to make it this cultural war issue by saying that the only people who care about empire are, kind of racial minorities or people who, are concerned with statues that are in the city. And if you care about real issues, if you care about, in-work poverty of mothers, if you care about the deindustrialized North, if you care about austerity being imposed on the British state following 2008, you don't have time to talk about empire. I mean, these are niche topics of kind of, identity, university snowflakes. And what I want to do by talking about the material and capitalist aspects of the British Empire is remind us that, no, if you want to talk about global inequality today, you might want to talk about the British overseas territories that have become the main tax havens in the world.
Yeah.
The Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, Bermuda. These, according to the Tax Justice Network, are the 3 largest tax havens in the world. They are ongoing legacies of the British Empire. There's not, the Cayman Islands isn't magically British overseas territories. It was taken as a British colony in the 1670 Treaty of Madrid alongside Jamaica. And then, following Jamaica's independence, transformed into this offshore warehousing of financial wealth. This is part of the history of the British Empire. If we want to talk about the history of the British Empire, we want to be talking about the way in which London's commercial court continues to be the main mechanism for financial disputes all around the world, which make
Really?
Yeah, absolutely. 70%.
Why is that? Is that because all the accounting firms are in London?
So London, there's 70% of cases in the London Commercial Court of 2019 were foreign company disputes. And so London continues to be, and the City of London continues to be, the kind of, pathway through which global financial capital moves, which allows for an enrichment of particularly some areas of this city, a lot of poverty in the city as well.
Yeah.
But this massive differentiation between the living standards of the parts of London that appeal to global capital and the rest of the United Kingdom. That legacy is part of the British Empire. And so we talk about that part of it, I think it makes it much harder to try and separate out people who care about, kind of the left behind, those who've been struggling with in-work poverty and material interests with those who are concerned with issues of kind of race and identity. When we look at empire through a kind of material lens, we can see how those two things aren't opposed to each other. They're actually connected.
You're really making me think about this in a way that I had never thought about the British Empire really properly before. Thanks for making it all the way to the end of the video. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment for us in the comments below. Let me know what you thought and if you'd like to see more of this from the show. Thank you, and we'll see you again next time.